Welcome to the Planbpreneur podcast. This podcast is for professionals, entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, and leaders who want to create greater income and impact. On the podcast, we explore strategies, tools, and techniques for creating multiple streams of income, launching your entrepreneurial dreams, and living a life of impact. We bring to you amazing guests and experts, as well as practical opportunities to help you achieve your entrepreneurial goals. This is the Planbpreneur podcast, and I am your host, Damien. All right, Gaidi, thank you so much for joining me today with this conversation, and I'm really excited and grateful that we are able to talk about this topic. I've had the opportunity to work with you, and it's been a pleasurable experience all through, and I still continue to appreciate all the work that we do and the support that you give to me. And so I'm grateful that you're making time out for this conversation. But more importantly, I value your perspective on these issues, and I'm sure that for the book and for people who are going to listen to this or listening to this right now, there's going to be a lot of insightful things that they will be able to take away from this conversation. So thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Absolutely pleasure.
Awesome. And I know that I know a bit about your story. I know that you've headed up businesses, educational institutions, been there, done that, and done all of that. And but I'm going to allow you to share some of that story and some of that background as we tease some of the insights out of that and draw the parallels with this conversation. So the first question, the obvious one, is what do you do? Who are you, and where are you coming from? What's your journey? I know it's a bit of a big question out there, but we appreciate some of that unpacking and context for this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in general, when people ask that question, I like to play around with saying I'm a Pan-African solutionist. And when we get into the conversation about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking, we can talk more about what it means to be a solutionist. I'm really about trying to solve problems. And I say I'm a Pan-African solutionist because, ever since I was young, I've been really passionate about building Pan-African networks and building a kind of brighter vision for what a Pan-African world can look like. I was born and raised in California, so come from an African-American background, but have always had a passion for and been interested in making those Pan-African connections and seeing how I could connect my work to the larger work of the African diaspora. I wound up, I got involved in community organization work when I was in college, and then wound up going to graduate school and studied, got a PhD in African diaspora studies, so became even more passionate about working with the African diaspora, and then eventually moved to East Africa. And so I've spent most of my adult life living and working in Africa, some community focused, some strictly in the business sense, and then always kind of straddling the line with higher education, and recently kind of moved my focus back to higher education. So currently I'm a full-time professor, but also I do consulting in the higher ed space, and I also still run a business on the side.
Oh, it's good stuff. No, and I don't know if I heard this story from you or if it was from somebody else about you building a city somewhere or a town somewhere. I don't know if it's fable stuff or did that really happen?
So unfortunately, no, it never happened. But
Okay.
where it might have come from, I'd shared the story at ALU in the past. When really trying to push our students to think big. When I graduated from my first degree, when I did my undergraduate degree, my goal immediately out of college was to start a new city. I figured, if we talk about social ills and all the problems we have, why not start from a clean slate? And so a few of my friends and I, we kind of put together some plans, and we were trying to do all this kind of stuff kind of under the radar so people didn't know about it. But we secretly wanted to establish a new city, get it incorporated kind of under the radar before there's too much public pushback, and then begin to build an economic base. And we started studying what that would look like, how we could build housing, low cost housing, recruit people to move into our new town, and kind of expand from there. So, yeah, my first several years out of college were really focused on building this new city. And we were a bit young and optimistic, and maybe a little bit overly ambitious, so it never came to pass. But yes, that was one of my early entrepreneurial ventures.
That's cool. No, that's interesting. And you're talking about solutioning and really like, and I think solutions come in many shapes and sizes and forms. But it takes some level of thinking to think, okay, we can actually build a city, a new city, instead of, because you're talking about instead of fixing or remodeling an existing one. It would have been cool to actually see the city come to life and see what whether we should be thinking, and maybe we should be thinking about building new cities, or even if we're not thinking about building new cities, thinking about how can we renew existing cities and all that. And I just want to hear more about your story. So this entrepreneurial streak that started out with you trying to build a new city also took you to East Africa. I know some of that. You did some of that work on the continent from an entrepreneurial perspective. What was that about? How did you do that?
Well, it's interesting that you ask about what drove me to go to East Africa, because a lot of it was driven by Julius Nyerere, who was the first president of Tanzania when they got their independence, and he had put out a call for nation building. Right, so when Tanzania gets their independence, and a lot of other African countries were getting their independence in the early 1960s, one of the issues that a lot of them were faced with was they did not have a very skilled workforce. They did not have a very educated population. A lot of these countries, because of the way colonialism was structured, very few people had a chance to get a higher education. A lot of countries didn't even have colleges or universities at all. If you did well in secondary school, you were shipped off to the colonial metropole to get educated in London or Paris or something like that. So very small educated workforce at a time when they needed doctors and engineers and people to build their colleges. And so Nyerere had put out a call, what he called a call for nation building, where he was asking Africans throughout the diaspora to move back to Tanzania and help them build the new nation. And that always resonated with me. Now, by the time I moved, many years had passed, Nyerere had passed away, and the nation building call had kind of passed away. But I think as an idea, it still resonated with me, and it's still something that a lot of African countries really need to think about in terms of how do we reverse that brain drain that had happened in the 70s and the 80s,
Mm,
the so-called last decade, and recruit a skilled workforce back to the continent. At the same time, when you ask about entrepreneurship, in my mind, when I think about kind of the greatest African entrepreneurs, I think about people like Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, those people who are really about nation building projects. I see nation building as a form of entrepreneurship. You've got to, figure out how you're going to provide power, how you're going to do, build universities, build secondary and primary
yeah,
schools. And so there's all these different assets that are necessary in a nation building project that require entrepreneurial thinking, problem solving skills, really a solutionist focused mindset. So that's what originally drew me to East Africa. And now when I got there, it was kind of the beginning of the Africa Rising narrative, which was just the next wave of this nation building project, where a lot of the ideas of institution building had been privatized, and people were thinking about, you know, private sector solutions to a lot of the problems that a lot of these countries were facing because of issues with governance and
yeah.
corruption and a lot of other reasons. But to me, the same spirit of nation building was kind of being manifested in the next generation, and I wanted to be a part of that.
It's good. That's good. That's what drew you. And I think this whole idea of entrepreneurial thinking of entrepreneurial approaches, like you said, it's certainly needed in different sectors or throughout every field of life, including governance, because I don't want to go into that right now, but compared to people like in Nyerere, we want to wonder what's the kind of thinking that is now driving how governments are thinking about their countries. And I think it's easy to actually look at Africa and see, okay, which governments are thinking entrepreneurially or which governments are just following, or and that's a whole thing, and we can talk about it. But I would really like to also bring it to individuals because I think that from that sum of the part makes the whole, or out of that entire population is what we then have the governments that rises out of that. And I'm curious to I just go back and just sort of go back to you, right? And talking about some of your other I'm going to come back to how do people translate entrepreneurial pursuits for themselves. But for you, how has it manifested over the years, right? From coming, trying to build a city, coming to the continent. What are the other things that where you've leveraged entrepreneurial approaches
Hmm.
in bringing stuff to life?
It's a great question because for many years I never thought about myself as someone who was an entrepreneur or who was embracing entrepreneurial thinking because it's a very coded language and to a lot of people it means something very specific, and I think that's because of the way the media kind of gravitated to a certain type of prototypical entrepreneur based on an American model, particularly after the dot com boom, and everybody got excited about this new wealth that could be created through innovation and technology entrepreneurship. Um, but I've always, wanted to be about solving problems in the community, and I think entrepreneurship is a great way because you have to think about when you're trying to solve people's problems, they don't care about theory and ideology. They want to know how you can impact the material conditions of their lives, which means being able to provide jobs, being able to provide food security, housing security. And so I've looked at how could I, create opportunity for people, right? I've been blessed that I've had a lot of opportunity in my own life, opportunity to get higher education, opportunity to travel, to live in different countries, and so I understand that very few people in the world will ever experience the type of opportunities that I've had, and so how can I then share that and create opportunities for other people? And one of the most basic ways I've been able to do that was to be able to create projects that could employ other people, right? So creating employment for people is like one of the most basic things that you can do that changes someone's material conditions, um, can improve their station in life. Um, they can use that hopefully to create other opportunities for themselves by generating savings and be able to reinvest that and create their own employment opportunities. Um, and so that's where I really got passionate about the idea of entrepreneurship and business creation because I saw that as a way of creating opportunity for other people so they could also experience, you know, the beauty of life that I've had. I recognize how blessed I've been in my own life, and so I wanted to make sure that I was not selfish with that.
It's good. I love it. I think this is something I'm equally passionate about, the creating opportunity for other people. And I think that uh, every one of us, like you're saying, you said something, you said it's the most basic thing you can do. I was like, is it that basic or is it that simple? But I think that from the approach of everyone can step into the capacity to do this, like to create opportunity for others
Mm-hmm.
to initiate something that will allow other people to thrive. And so that's a really solid point. Something you said about projects, right? Versus, and we're talking about entrepreneurial approaches versus, if I contrast that to startups or
Mm-hmm.
to businesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
What Tell me a bit more about projects in that sense, because it means my thinking is that then you can do multiple of this, I guess, or so perhaps some of the projects you've done and some of the impact they had, but also why projects versus like a big business, or what are some of the value add that.
Well, this is where I think, we have to, like I said, I'm a Pan African solutionist. And so when you think about creating solutions for the African continent, I think there's some differences in what Africa needs versus the model that's being promoted globally. And again, you talked about trying to separate, the Nearies and kind of the people who are in government and state leaders. But where I'd say there are similarities is what they tried to do in the 60s was they created a non-alignment movement. And I think we need a degree of a
Mhm.
non-alignment movement in today's conversation about entrepreneurship, where we can say, hey, we're not trying to be entrepreneurs like the model that's coming out of China, and we're not trying to be entrepreneurs like the model that's coming out of the US. We need to think about what is the specific type of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking that will best serve the African continent. And
Okay.
I draw a distinction because what you see coming out of the West is people want to do huge projects and they want to build big corporations. Corporations don't necessarily have people in their best interest. right? Corporations are
Mm,
usually about serving shareholders. Shareholders are often remote, disconnected from the community, and already quite wealthy.
yeah,
That's how they can invest in companies. Um, and
yeah,
so I'm not about trying to build a company that really needs people to work for me under certain conditions for the next 10, 15, 20 years, because that doesn't allow those people to pursue their own ideas. When you think about projects, you think
got it.
about more short term, with a defined conclusion where somebody can say, I know that I can earn this much money on this project, and then I can take that money and do what I want with it. I can then get my time back and I can do whatever I want. But hopefully, in the course of the project, you create an environment where people can also learn new skills, build new networks, and so they can begin to see opportunities for themselves, right? And maybe they're not ready at the end
Yeah,
of the project, so they can roll off into another project, and so it's possible that somebody works for you over several years, but they work for you on multiple projects, and they're building up their own skill set, they're building up their own savings, so that they then have the capital to go off and do their own project, right, or start their own company or whatever they want to do. But I think projects are a way of thinking about it in terms of, again, creating opportunities, almost like a springboard or a launch pad for people, as opposed to trying to create a system in which you need people locked into your system for your benefit, but not for their own individual long term benefit.
that's solid there. And I think it's something that I really want to interrogate a bit more. But I think there's two things you mentioned earlier on as well. I think so. This idea of one, people being able to work across multiple projects. Uh, the way corporations have defined, I think, in the sense what jobs should look like,
Hmm.
doesn't make people best suited for that kind of what we call volatility,
Hmm.
or maybe you have to work across multiple projects. Sometimes people are not necessarily skilled, right, to have the kind of float or the kind of thinking. And I'm coming to how do you address that? Because also as we think about, I think corporations are also realizing that there is this non-alignment, like you're saying, especially with the breadth of information and opportunity and a lot of the changes in the world. And people also want to be able to say, you know what, I want control of my time. I want control of the ability to be able to create something. And that is coming up. And corporations are also getting to the point where, you know what, we're doing short contracts and we just want the skill sets
Hmm.
that we need for this particular period of time. And I'll be curious to know what are your thoughts on how people embrace perhaps this kind of mindset? Should it be, because we're talking about the non-alignment as well? Is this one of the things that might define entrepreneurial approach on the continent in the coming few years? And then how do people also, if need be, adjust to that, so to speak, or thrive in that? I think that would be a better word.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the other reason why I like a project model is that it's a little bit more flexible and iterative, where you can say, okay, we tried this in this direction, it didn't necessarily work the way we wanted, so we can quickly pivot, make some changes. As opposed to if you start from the beginning with the mindset that you're going to build a huge, massive corporation that's going to scale at a certain point, then you kind of lock yourself into a particular model. And if it's not working, um, it's harder to change and pivot, and sometimes you have a particular bias where you blame other factors for why it's not working instead of acknowledging that maybe the model itself is incorrect for the particular context in which you're operating. Whereas a project based approach allows you to kind of test the waters and see if the model fits, or if you need to make some adjustments or come back with a new model, and try again. Um, a caveat here, because you mentioned, sometimes a lot of corporations are moving to short-term contracts, et cetera. We have to be clear. A lot of corporations are moving to short-term contracts because they don't want to commit to supporting their workers in a particular way, right? So they do short-term contracts. They don't have to pay health insurance. They don't have to, lock you in. And I think there is space in society for creating long-term secure jobs. Not everybody wants to start their own business or their own venture. They want the security and stability of that type of employment. And I think that's okay. and we need to create opportunities for that as well. Um, but we also need to think about the types of models that will benefit the critical mass of people. When we talk about entrepreneurship in Africa, everybody's getting excited about the demographic dividend, how we've got this huge youth generation that's going to kind of migrate into the workforce, in the next couple decades, and how Africa will soon have the largest workforce in the world. And everybody talks about it as this opportunity. And there's a comparison between Africa and China. But I would challenge us to really think about how do we leapfrog some of the problems that the industrial growth in China experienced, or the industrial growth in the United States. So before that, the industrial revolution in Europe, where you really, yes, you had a huge surge in a certain type of work and certain type of labor, but in general, it was a very harsh type of labor, right? And so, how do we think about skipping that phase? Like, how do you go from a largely agrarian society in Africa? Everybody's migrating to the cities, everybody's looking for work. How do we skip that phase of giving everybody demeaning and backbreaking work, right? So, how do we think about creating jobs that are healthy, that have long term potential, that are sustainable, that allow people to have positive and productive lives without them having to fight and struggle and protest for basic working conditions, right? For basic rights in the workplace, et cetera. And so I think that's where, again, we talk about project based versus kind of the corporation doing short term hiring. We really have to think about what is a model that has a focus on improving the lives and the material conditions of the critical mass of the population in Africa, right? And so that's what I'm more interested in when we talk about entrepreneurship. Too
Yeah.
often from the West,
Well, that's
kind
good.
of, excuse me.
No, I'm with you.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah, I was
so
saying too
that's
often
good.
the
Yeah.
West uses like financial models to talk about success. They talk about GDP, et cetera, but they don't often talk about how kind of that bulk of the middle of the population is faring from economic growth, right? So if you look across Africa right now, some countries with the highest GDP are also countries that have the most percentage of the population below the poverty line because of the unequal distribution of wealth and access, right? So when you look at some of the oil producing countries, um, it's a very polarized society. We've got this extreme elite on one side and most of the population living in poverty. How do we create a situation where the critical mass of that group in the middle has healthy and productive lives, and they're able to create small businesses or small ventures for themselves to support their families, or they're able to find gainful employment in some of the rising larger companies and corporations that exist. But all of them, whether it's a large corporation or a small kind of family owned company, are contributing to the overall growth and betterment of society, so that everybody is enjoying the fruits of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's about empowering people, but also helping people to thrive in that sense. And do you have you seen this work? Are there maybe like models of success, um, or examples? Perhaps is there anybody who's doing this well, or do you have an idea of what this might look like, if you were to say, okay, this is a template, or this is a perhaps something that can work? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a good question. I mean, I think there are a lot of models that people are toying with in different places. So some places talk about a universal basic income, for example, and a universal basic income is already paid by a lot of different societies that have natural resources. So it's very common in certain oil producing countries for the entire population to get a share of the oil revenue, right? And there are several African countries that could employ that and meet the basic financial needs of kind of the lower end of society, but they're not employing that model. But that'd be a very similar model to a universal basic income where, if somebody knows that their family is housed and is fed, it creates space for that person to then allow the creative juices to flow, and they can start becoming more of an entrepreneurial thinker than somebody who's so focused on just feeding their kids that they've got to take any kind of menial job they can get just to scrape together a few cents to buy food. So I think solutions like that are very feasible. There's also policy considerations. So I think there's things governments can do, particularly in Africa, where there's plenty of evidence that shows lower barriers to not just trade, but lower barriers to travel and movement of people, allows for increased economic activity and economic development. I think places like Rwanda are doing a good job where they're saying, hey, we got visa free entry for people across the African continent. We're encouraging people to come in and start businesses. They're trying to create a more conducive business environment. But at the same time, you see a country like Rwanda also investing in their infrastructure. So they've got good roads, they've got safety, they have security, because what they're saying is, okay, not everybody's going to be able to be an entrepreneur. Not everybody's going to be able to make a lot of money, but everybody should be able to benefit from a basic investment in the country, right? As opposed to
Yeah.
the other end of that spectrum would be a country that makes almost no investment in infrastructure. So you've got some people who are extremely wealthy and they've got a great house, but there's terrible roads just outside their gates, right? They've got a generator, so they're not
Yeah.
worried about the fact that there's no electricity in their neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the wrong model. And so, how do we kind of promote a
Mm.
policy conversation so that there's a closer relationship between government and entrepreneurship, that benefits, like I said, the critical mass of society?
That's good. And sort of this is government's role and what government can do, and sort of shifting gears a bit to, and you talked a bit about what corporates might be able to do in terms of about the models that empower people and also allow people to be able to fulfill their goals or to meet their other dreams and needs. And we've talked about the project model, and I want to get into what can the individuals do, right? uh, I think there is a fair sort of distribution. Again, the system is a lot of it, but I think that um, from this concept of entrepreneuring, there's something to be said about what individuals can do as well, even though it doesn't solve the entire thing. But to start with, you mentioned something earlier to say entrepreneurship, and that old word entrepreneurial thinking has been colored by other perspectives or
Mhm.
imported definitions. So, if we were to really dig into this concept of entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial doing per se, and you talk about solutioning and what does it entail? How do you do it? How do you
Mhm.
practice it? How do people do that? Yeah.
So, and that's a great question. I think this. I wish this was a conversation that was had more often in these so-called entrepreneurial circles. So I constantly see people doing, you know, innovation hubs and doing conferences around entrepreneurship or doing pitch competitions, but they generally focus on one thing, which is usually kind of the financial metrics, right? And so, when to me, being an entrepreneur is about being a problem solver first. Making money doesn't necessarily solve problems. Creating a product that might have a need in a certain market, or maybe you can, convince people of a need through, creative marketing, etc. That doesn't necessarily solve a problem. And you have to be very careful about not creating other problems, through the solving your problem. So that's where you have to have consideration of environmental factors. But again, coming back to, people's well-being, consideration of labor factors. So I constantly kind of remind entrepreneurs, particularly in Africa, where it is um, such a young market and there are so many opportunities for people to grow and have influence, that you have to think about yourself holistically, right? So an entrepreneur is also a
Mm,
policymaker, because if you are successful, you become one of the larger taxpayers, for example. Taxpayers have influence and you can influence policy, but you also influence policy through how you model your own business, right? So if you want to influence labor practices, then you create labor conditions within your own ecosystem, right? That demonstrate the type of labor system and workers' rights and pay scales, et cetera, that you want to see across the board. Don't say, oh, I'm going to wait for someone else to do it, or I'm going to wait for government to pass a particular law. Say, no, if this is how workers should be treated, if this is what a minimum livable wage is, then this is what I'm going to pay people. And so I think there's a lot of things that entrepreneurs can do to think holistically about how they solve problems, and not just be narrowly focused on a particular problem a product that they're trying to deliver to the market, or a particular brand that they're trying to create. And they don't worry about a lot of the unintended consequences that come out of their business practices.
yeah. Yeah, that's good. I like the holistic approach to it. And just pushing that further along the lines of people wouldn't necessarily identify as entrepreneurs,
Hmm.
right? But want to be or need to be entrepreneurial. So, and there's perhaps a number of motivations. Like you're saying, it starts with problem solving. Everyone can solve a problem, but also to thrive in this kind of project based environment, there's perhaps some level of ownership that comes with being able to think about how do you coordinate yourself and how do you attend to the projects and how do you learn and curate for yourself. If you're in a corporation or in an organized big space, probably are thinking about you, thinking about your growth to the level that they can think about it. But then how do you go beyond that? And how do you take on this entrepreneurial mindset? And now I'm talking about people that are not necessarily uh, entrepreneurs who don't have that bug to go start something.
Hmm.
Because I think as we talk about distributed work and the changes in the workplace, this is certainly becoming a more increasingly valuable skill set.
Hmm. Hmm.
And just to be fair as well, the data that we've seen, especially data we are collecting for our own work, people who are working think that the biggest skill they're lacking is the entrepreneurial skill or the entrepreneurial mindset. Now, we've tried to clarify that that doesn't necessarily mean starting a business, but being able uh, to create and to be able to thrive and to solve problems and change things. So, how do people, those group of people, how do you do that, right? How do you transition to that?
There's no single solution, but this again, I think that's why this conversation is important. And I think, pushing conversations like this in more of these spaces, because often you'll hear maybe somebody in a position of leadership, a position of power, complaining that they're not getting enough creative work, creative feedback from their team. They don't have enough entrepreneurial thinkers, but then they're also shutting people down. They don't want new ideas. They don't want critique and criticism, because the reality is, the process of problem solving begins with analyzing the problem, right? Which begins with being willing to be critiqued, to have your own work critiqued, to have your projects critiqued, to take that type of feedback. And we need to create space for that type of healthy feedback, without always being defensive, putting people down, playing power dynamics, and not listening to people. So it's a two-sided thing. On the one hand, we need people who aren't trying to be entrepreneurs themselves to allow themselves to be more creative and to give more creative feedback in whatever space they're working, but also for people in leadership and positions of power to be more receptive to that type of feedback and to encourage it more, to reward people and not punish people when they give critical feedback around a particular project or a job task. So that has to happen on multiple levels, or people are going to get forced back in their shell. At the same time, one of the things, the phrases that I do like that's coming out of this whole narrative is this idea of a lifelong learner. So it doesn't matter whether you're starting your own business or you're working for someone else, or you're kind of a person that is, consulting and kind of jumping from project to project, but always kind of contributing to someone else's work. You still need to set aside a certain amount of time for you to continue to read, to explore new content, to explore new ideas, and to constantly learning about the changes, because the world is changing so rapidly right now. You might find a niche in which you're like, oh, this is great. I've got a skill fit. I can contribute to these different people's projects. But when are you going to become outdated? Right? If you're not careful,
Mm,
very quickly, your skill set is going to no
yeah.
longer be necessary because you've been replaced by AI or new techniques or some new app that somebody created. So, how are you constantly kind of keeping abreast of what the changes are and what the needs are, in the particular community that you serve? And what are ways in which you can constantly kind of upskill yourself, so that you remain valuable in the market? Whatever area you're passionate about, whether it's supporting other people's ventures or creating ventures of yourself, or just making sure that you can provide security for your own family. People constantly need to be learning and to be growing, not just for reasons of the market, but because that's how we create a better society, right? You don't want people kind of locked in mindsets of the past. You want people constantly kind of having open minds and learning and taking in new information, being exposed to new cultures, to new ideas. et cetera. So I think that's where it starts. This idea of lifelong learning and people always having kind of these growth mindsets that they're willing to absorb new information, reconsider their own positions on different things, and to be creative and share that information.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I like the lifelong learning. And you were mentioning something about, you need to be able to evolve, grow, but also taking care of yourself, your own family, and all that. And I want to talk a bit about like creating income and impact because we use that term a lot. How do, I don't know, in your own experience, how have you diversified, for example, your streams of income?
Mhm.
I think so. We talk about this whole entrepreneurial concept. Easily, people relate it to money, like you're saying. But the language you like to use at Planbpreneur is really to say create income and impact. And because, for to an extent, and this is legitimate, people still need income to take care of themselves and their families. The truth is, and I think looking at some of the data around what do people earn on the continent, there's only a very few number of people who would be in jobs that are enough to take care of, that they can say would, a lot of people have to figure out other ways, right? And I'm just curious to hear a bit more on that, practically, in terms of now how have you done that? What are your thoughts on that? How do people go about creating new income for themselves, and impact along the way as well? Yeah, just to talk a bit about that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a couple things to that, and this is where I think it's really important to separate opportunities and challenges in Africa versus in the West or in other places. One of the things an old school saying has always been, a penny saved is a penny earned. And this idea that, if you save money, that's just as good as having earned money. And I think a modern iteration on that is really getting people to understand what their actual needs are. So when you start thinking about how you feed your family, how you provide, how do you make do on whatever salary you have, you really need to start with an assessment of what your actual needs are and where you're spending money. Because there is so much marketing coming at us from all these different angles. People think, oh, I need this, I need this, I need this. And there's this chase for material goods as opposed to a chase of a
Interesting.
certain material kind of condition of life. And if you reevaluate those things, you'll find all of a sudden that maybe you actually have more resources available to yourself than you thought because you're not spending money over here in a wasteful way. Um, and you're not just chasing the conspicuous consumption and kind of the impulse buying that we're conditioned to do through media. If you can become more disciplined in that, that is one of the first things that people can do to really kind of change their own economic condition. The next thing is recognizing that there are just a huge amount of opportunities in Africa if you think of yourself as an entrepreneur and you want to take advantage of those opportunities without trying to model yourself after the West. One of the best examples to me about the differences is a story I read years ago about Procter and Gamble. So Procter and Gamble is one of the biggest manufacturers in the world in terms of soaps and household cleaners and et cetera, et cetera. But they have internal rules against working in the informal sector because to a lot of people in the West, the informal sector, because it's quote unquote informal, is therefore also illegal, right? You've got unregistered businesses, therefore illegal. We're not going to do business with them. And Procter and Gamble didn't understand how to enter the African market because so many retailers and distributors were actually informal, right? Once they cracked the code and figured out how they could actually establish a distribution network that accessed the informal network became their second largest distributor globally after Walmart, right? So it became a huge revenue stream, right? I think too often young people are kind of swayed by articles and media and all the hype around entrepreneurship that they think they have to set up some sort of formal business in order to create a new stream of income, as opposed to just taking advantage of kind of the local informal market around them, where they might be able to provide a service or product or be a reseller of something without having to set up a formal business. And that's what I
That's good.
also appreciate about a number of African countries who have tried to ease the barriers to entry for micro entrepreneurs. right? People who are coming in, and if you're below a certain threshold, they're not worried about you having a formalized business with a business license and taxes, et cetera. But you do have to be careful about what those thresholds are. But I think there are a lot of opportunities for people to create secondary streams of income in the informal space. And instead of shunning the informal space and looking down on them or kind of dismissing the informal as, oh, that's for the uneducated or that's for really poor people. No, the informal space is a huge market opportunity for those people who need secondary and third sources of income. And we should take advantage of it and not try and only model our business ideas off of what works in the West that already has a certain structure and bureaucracy that works for them, but might not work for current market situations in a lot of African countries.
Interesting. Interesting. That's often overlooked. But again, I think, like you're saying, it's micro, and I think it's overlooked by maybe a group of people. But I also see recently a number of entrepreneurs who are trying to build big businesses and now trying to go into that space
Yeah.
as well to
And
really
the people chasing businesses, we often there's another saying I like. It's called leaving money on the table, right? Like a lot of people will turn away from opportunities to make a consistent income because they think it's too small for them, right? But again, that's where you have to be clear about what your
I
needs
see.
are because often it's enough or more than enough, right? It might never make you a billionaire, but you don't really need to be a billionaire, right? So it's like being clear about what your needs are and then saying, hey, there's a huge opportunity here. I can make consistent, reliable, steady income, right? That maybe it doesn't have a huge opportunity for scaling and growing, but it does have a lot of consistency and I can rely on this and it's not going to require a heavy lift on my side, right? And so people should take advantage of those opportunities instead of looking down on them like, oh, that's not big enough. I want to be on the cover of African Enterprise, right? Like not everybody's going to get that opportunity. And too many people miss out on the chances for stable income because they're chasing that moonshot.
Interesting. That's that's what I want to. I was going to say that's contrarian, but that's non-regular in the sense that a lot of the messaging is going this other way, and it's hard sometimes for people to really hear things like this to say, how do I not overlook the opportunities that are already around me, right? But that's certainly interesting. And where do you start from for if you want to do that kind of thing? Where do people start from? What are some of the practical things to get that going right? Yeah, I guess.
And and this is to your point about being contrary to the typical narrative that's put out there. It's because I think a lot of the narrative is disingenuous because it's based on a Western model where the resources available to those people that we often look to as models was very different, right? So when you think about this traditional idea of a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, computer entrepreneur, you know, uh, going back to like a Steve Jobs. Oh, Steve Jobs created Apple in his parents' garage. Well, yes, that means his parents had a house that had a garage, right? And so if he
Yeah.
failed in his venture, he could just walk through the door into the kitchen and be perfectly secure in his parents' house. So when they say, oh, you fail
Good
fast
stuff.
and fail forward, these are people who have safety nets if they fail, right?
Yeah.
You know, uh, Bill Gates got a $600,000 loan from his parents, right? Um, Amazon, Jeff Bezos got a $300,000 loan from his parents, right? Elon Musk's parents own a mining, operation. Like these are people who had significant resources already in their family, right? So you cannot push African entrepreneurs to start off the same way because they don't have the same resources, the same connection. Although if you do look across the continent, you will see that a lot of the most successful entrepreneurs or the ones who are promoted in the media in a lot of these African countries are actually the children of some of the wealthy elites, right? Because you need a certain type of capital to start off at that level. But I think what we should take away from those models is you start with your friends and family, right? Now that might mean you have to start at a much smaller level, but that's okay. That's where you're more likely to find success is if you go to your friends and family, you find out what their needs are, what the needs in your immediate community are. And if those people support you, they maybe want to invest in you, they're also going to want to see you be successful, right? If all of your funding and support comes externally from outside of your local community, your local community is not vested in your success, right? Some of them, to be quite honest, might be kind of bitter and resentful and they want to see you fail. But if you are relying on your local community for your startup, for your, venture, whatever it is, and you're also serving their needs, they're going to be vested in your success. They're going to want to support your business. They're going to come to your restaurant. They're going to buy your product, whatever it is. So I think everybody who is serious about creating additional streams of income and building a successful business needs to start with their immediate community, right? Start with your neighbors, start with your family, start with those people that you live around, and figure out what kind of service you can provide to them.
That's good. That's good. And just as we try and bring this to a wrap, two questions. One is, well, and I'm going back to this idea of future work and thinking about the larger population of people who are not necessarily entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial. What should African professionals be doing today to secure the future? What should they be changing, perhaps? And what are the opportunities that are peculiar to the continent for African professionals in that
Mhm.
space? Yeah,
Well, again, I think it starts with the idea that everybody has to see themselves as a policymaker, right? Like what a lot of if you take the United States, a lot of people look at the United States as a model for entrepreneurship and business growth, but they don't look at the 40, 50 years of struggle that the United States went through in the 1930s and 40s and 50s in terms of the intense labor battles, the amount of union organizing that was going on, et cetera, and a pivot that the United States government made policy wise to support the emerging middle class because they recognize that if this system is going to last, it needs a large middle class. It needs people who can work and support their families in a positive way, right? They need to feel like they're also benefiting from the economy. And so modern entrepreneurs on the larger end of the scale need to really be cognizant of that, right? If you want to build a sustainable, long term company, corporation, personal empire, you need to do it in a stable society. So, what are you doing to contribute to the long term stability of the society that you live in, right? If you are on the other side of the spectrum and you're not trying to build a huge empire, you're not trying to be an entrepreneur in terms of starting an individual business, but you are concerned about the future of work and how it's going to impact you, you still get a chance to be a policymaker because you get a chance to define what the future of work looks like in Africa. Because the future of work in Africa does not have to follow the same trajectory that it followed in China or that it followed in 1950s America when they were doing manufacturing was the main source of income for people. Um, so I think this young generation, like I said, they have to really think about being lifelong learners and think about what they want the future of work to look like, right? Do they want it to be remote? Do they want it to be flexible? Do they want it to be short term project based? Um, what does it look like? And then they get to define that based on how they negotiate in the workspace. And if they are doing that collectively, right? And so even though everybody's maybe an independent consultant, but they all are kind of saying, this is our baseline and this is what we expect in the workforce, then they'll get to impact the way in which economic development happens across the African continent. So I think it's real important for people to see themselves as powerful actors in their own future and not just wait on everyone else to be the ones who make the decisions or set the policies. Every individual needs to see themselves as a policymaker, needs to see themselves as someone who has impact on the growth and development of their own community and their society, and someone who has a voice. And that's how they'll impact what the future of Africa, the future of work in Africa can really look like.
I love it. I love it. So good and empowering. And I think, yeah. So my final question, obviously, is what for you? What's the impact you're trying to create going forward with your businesses? What are your hopes for what you do next? And you talked about empowering people in some of the projects you've done in the past. Is that some of the future as well, and some of the things you're trying to do? What are your hopes for continue
What are
to
my
do this
hopes?
kind of
So,
work.
it's an interesting thing. I those things I hope for the most are things I'm pretty sure I will not live to see because they will take some time to manifest. But my primary background, even though I spent a lot of time in entrepreneurial space, et cetera, is actually in history. And as a history buff, one of the things that I think is most fascinating is the fact that Africa, at many points in the past, was the richest region in the world. Right? And I think a lot of people forget that because we're so focused on the immediate past, right? But if we go back not too far in the past, but we go back beyond colonialism, there was a period for quite a while where West Africa was the wealthiest part of the world. Before that, Egypt and the Nile Valley was the wealthiest and most developed part of the world. And I don't believe in a world that's polarized. So Africa doesn't have to be the wealthiest, but I would like to do what I can to contribute to Africa moving back into a space where it is a place of abundance and majority of the population live healthy and productive lives, lives that are safe and secure and happy, as opposed to some of the struggles that we have seen on the continent in my lifetime. So, whatever I can do to contribute to that kind of shift to get us back to um, the empowered communities, countries, nation states, and empires that we once had on the African continent.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. And I can't wait to see how you do. And I think this is part of the journey why we must continue to champion the African uh, uniqueness and originality and just like you were saying earlier on, defining what we want the future to look like and having that voice and actually shaping what works here. I think that that is so powerful, and there is the power to do that if more people learn and understand that they can actually do that. Because I think coming from a place of disempowerment or disinformation, again, with a lot of that media and a lot of other factors, we're now at the place where there has to be that awakening, and we can't have enough of this conversations. So I'm super grateful for the time that you have shared with me. And this is a very rich conversation that I'm going to listen to personally again and to really distill some of that. And I feel like it's empowering for people who listen and are listening as well. Thank you so much, Gaidi, again for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for pushing this. Like I said, I think we need more of these conversations. So I really appreciate what you're doing, trying to get out there and talk to people about defining entrepreneurship and what being an entrepreneur looks like for people on the African continent.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.